basically recognizing that we have experienced this global retreat of democracy and this rise of authoritarianism, and that this is a key dimension of the strategic context in which our national security is taking place. And so really wanting to advocate to the Biden administration about the need to support the elevation of democracy as a part of that national security approach, and to integrate that more fully into our domestic policy agenda, and the foreign policy agenda. And so the rest of our report really gets at how do we do this? How do we recommend or propose that this be done? So the next kind of two buckets of strategies recommend kind of focusing on things that we've traditionally done, right? The importance of engaging with our partners, our allies, to push back on authoritarianism, to reinforce cooperation, solidarity with partners that share our values, and also secondarily to scale up our investment in what are these very traditional pillars of democracy support, supporting free electoral processes, supporting independent media and civil society, all of which, as we know, are under pressure. And then the next kind of bucket of 4 strategies focus on addressing this new context. So there's a recommendation about investing in a new digital policy, technology policy agenda. So one that can support the development of an open, secure, and reliable internet, but protecting it from becoming weaponized in ways that restrict human rights or for repression. There's a recommendation focusing on the rebuilding of trust in the information environment, how we work to combat disinformation and hate speech. And then the final 2 recommendations really focus on these economic pieces, sort of the economic dimensions of democratic governance, the need to combat corruption and kleptocracy. And then finally, thinking about the ways that we can harness US economic power to more effectively address economic inequality and demonstrate the ways that democracy can deliver. So it's great to be able to talk to Tess and hear all the ways in which the Biden administration is taking on this new world that we're doing our work in, and to hear more from her now about how the administration is thinking about its approach to these challenges. So over to you, Tess.
Thanks, Ashley, for that kind introduction. First, I just wanted to apologize in advance if there's weird echoes or noises behind me. I'm very excitedly sitting next to an office doing a press conference. So just let me know if you can't hear me or are more entertained by the words behind me. So I'm thrilled to join all of you here today. Ashley, Barbara, Patrick, and Malvika for hosting this event. I hope you all noted that yesterday was the International Day of Democracy. And the first ever presidential statement on that day was issued. And so a lot of the themes I'm going to talk about today were reflected in that statement. So I think it was really fitting that Ashley broke down the multitude of challenges that the world face. They are essentially development challenges, right? So we're sitting here in a SID event and we're talking about how to improve human development around the world. And it's obvious that the fates of people, the spread of disease, the effects of climate change, the outcomes of conflict, and the backsliding of democracies across the globe affect the development of every person in every country around the world. So this sort of realization of the truly global interconnected nature of our world is sort of being laid bare. And so Ashley talked about a lot of the challenges we face, and essentially authoritarians are growing stronger, human rights abuses are proliferating, and facts themselves, the facts of what's going on the ground, are being undermined by disinformation and conspiracy theories, chipping away at public confidence in our courts, media, our scientists, and of course, even our elections. And we've seen this not just in places where authoritarianism has long been strong, but around the globe in democratic countries, including ourselves and our allies. So we're facing a distinct set of challenges where not only is there democratic backsliding in what we would call good performers, but we have authoritarians reaching across borders, targeting dissidents, journalists, and opposition leaders. We have authoritarian governments deploying digital tools to maintain both internal control and extend their international influence using censorship and surveillance and shutting down the internet, harassing human rights defenders. So we truly are seeing, as Ashley mentioned, sort of the internal and the exogenous factors of democratic recession happening across the globe. So given these threats at home and around the world, the Biden administration has made clear that it's in our national security interest to protect and renew democracy at home and support it abroad. And you've probably heard the president say many times that we are at an inflection point. We must prove that democracies can deliver for their people and to do so in a way that affirms and extends fundamental rights and dignity. So how we respond in this moment will define how we approach all of the pressing challenges of our time that Ashley mentioned, because healthy democratic institutions are essential to building resiliency to climate change, to public health threats, to creating equitable and inclusive economies, and for fostering peace and security. So President Biden has made clear that strengthening democracy is an animating force of his administration. And so domestically, that means working aggressively to protect the American people from COVID-19 through widespread vaccination. It has meant a focus on well-paying jobs and building out infrastructure and cutting child poverty. And it has also meant a concerted effort to deal honestly and openly with the imperfections and injustices in our own democratic system. We're working with Congress to advance legislation to protect the fundamental right to vote, make it easier for all Americans to exercise that right, to modernize and secure our elections, and to reform our campaign finance system. So in this way, the White House sees that contending with threats to democracy at home and doing the same abroad isn't an either-or proposition. We have to do both. And if you've had, tons of extra time to read our interim national security strategic guidance, it emphasizes our commitment to these issues. And it says, quote, "Democracy holds the key to freedom, prosperity, peace, and dignity." So moving from that strategic guidance, we know that we need a strong and affirmative narrative that democracies deliver for their people, whether that's economically or responding to crises like COVID-19. But we know we can't do this alone, and that established democracies are our closest allies and strongest partners in meeting these global challenges. So that means we need to invest in robust diplomatic leadership on these issues across the globe. We need to engage and re-engage multilaterally, including at the United Nations, and we need to really invest in economic engagement and foreign assistance. And so this means using foreign assistance tools to support democratic development directly, also to boost inclusive growth and pandemic recovery, and also to avoid debt traps advanced by authoritarian actors. So given that chapeau, I just wanted to highlight a few priority areas under the umbrella of democracy and human rights that the administration is focused on. So first, we're upping our game in the fight against corruption. The very first national security study memorandum that the president issued in his tenure was for combating corruption. We know that corruption hollows out well-functioning societies from the inside. It's used by repressive leaders to enrich themselves and their cronies, and it also extends and influences conflict and fragility around the world. And so under this national security memorandum, by the end of the year, departments and agencies are going to report back about what more they can do to combat corruption, both at home and abroad. So number two, we are investing in robust global civil society and independent media. And so due to expanding technology, efforts of repressive governments, free and independent media, which arguably is the lifeblood of democracy, the ability to share information, they're facing what many people call an extinction event. So we're thinking about ways to grow our support for markets, for independent media, how to partner with local civil society to keep civic space open, how to partner with media, civil society, and other actors to expose disinformation and to promote the sharing of accurate information, and to ensure that people are able to organize and advocate and hold their governments accountable to sort of strengthen that demand side of democracy. So third, we're bolstering strong human rights standards concerning the use of technology. I mean, this is a huge area. This means things like protecting against intrusive artificial intelligence-enabled surveillance technology, supporting the digital safety of human rights defenders online, and also promoting technologies that can be used to make governments more efficient, effective, transparent, and responsive to their citizens. And fourth and finally, we must grapple with our own legacies of injustice and inequity against marginalized groups and recommit to respecting and protecting the human rights of all people, no exceptions, across the globe. And so we've already started this, leading the charge by implementing presidential directives and executive orders on promoting equality for women, protecting the human rights of LGBTI persons, and advancing racial equity and inclusion, and equity and inclusion of all groups. So those four areas, countering corruption, reinvesting in civil society and media, bolstering human rights respecting technology, and grappling with equity and inclusion and respect for human rights, are all being catalyzed through what you've probably all already heard about, which is the Summit for Democracy. So President Biden will host a virtual Summit for Democracy on December 9th and 10th. This is an opportunity to drive serious commitments, both domestically and internationally, from our allies in democracy and human rights. And then we hope that this year's summit will serve as a catalyzing event more broadly for more broad-based sort of policy and programming changes in the long term. So in closing, I think, Ashley and I both reflected on the fact that we need a global coordinated response to this clear sort of assertion of authoritarianism and democratic backsliding. We need this approach to be advanced both domestically and internationally because the US should be leading by example. This comes down to the fact that democracy, unlike autocracy, is people powered. So at the end of the day, people across the globe should be defining what democracy and development means to them. So I really look forward to our conversation today to discuss how all of us can support the empowerment of civil society, regular people around the globe to organize and problem solve and develop solutions. Thanks.
Thanks, Tess. I think I'm taking it over so we can chat a bit more about all of the great initiatives that the administration is elevating in order to address the challenges that we both discussed. And I think, it's clear to me that, and I think for all of us who've heard you speak, the other staff of the NSC and the president himself, that democracy is a priority at home and abroad, as you've said. But we all know that when we're working on democracy in the context of kind of our broader national security and foreign policy agendas, that that there's always tension, there's always or often tension, and some trade-offs that have to be made. So, I'm just curious, how does democracy fit, not just in and of itself as a foreign policy and domestic policy issue of concern, but within this broader national security policy framework that the administration is going to be implementing?
That's a great question. And I think many of us who've been working on this issue for many years have always seen that inherent tension with what some people would argue are hard national security interests as opposed to values, as we may refer to democracy and human rights. But I think this administration is articulating that advancing democracy and human rights is not just a value, it is a hard national security interest. The VDEM reporting, as well as a lot of other data, show that democracies are more peaceful, prosperous, and secure. And so all of the things we're trying to achieve, like you mentioned, like income, equity, and economic development, all of those things, recovery from a pandemic, are more successful when they are done through the lens of democratic governance and full respect for human rights. So we are trying to pose those concepts as in line with every other very serious national security priority that we would take into consideration, whether it's, discussions about nuclear weapons or discussions about peacekeeping forces in regions experiencing instabilities. We want to be able to describe how in all of these other national security interests, how democratic governance and human rights can help us achieve those goals as well. We also have to recognize that, yes, sometimes approaches to promoting democracy and human rights might might be in tension with other interests in specific countries and at moments of time. And I think what we're looking for is an honest reckoning between those interests and between short, medium, and long-term goals, and to be able to clearly articulate those to decision makers and enable them to have all of the facts and the positions available to them to know that a certain action may result in what is perceived as stability with a current leader, but in 2, 3, 5, or 10 years may result in, widespread norms breakdown, or the fact that we're not supporting institutions in a specific country. It does not matter how much you support an individual leader, that change will not be sustainable. And so I don't think we're going to win every battle, as it were, in terms of having democracy and human rights being, the number one national security priority. But I think we are making great headway in ensuring that democracy and human rights are considered a vital national security interest alongside others, and that the trade-offs we make over time become sort of more and more informed by those facts.
Thanks. That's as we all know, a challenging set of trade-offs. And I think I'm sure there will be lots of folks here and outside that'll be looking to see how you've approached those kinds of trade-offs in individual cases. I also, I'm thinking about UNGA coming up this month and next week, I guess, or the week after. And some of the other challenges we just spoke about with regard to addressing misinformation, the rise of digital repression. These are like pan-global challenges requiring, requiring real partnership with other countries to address. So I'm curious how you are thinking about this challenge of the rise of digital repression, misinformation, and specifically how to leverage these kinds of partnerships with other countries to address them, since we certainly can't do that alone.
So I think you almost answered your own question, which is that we can't address them without these multilateral and bilateral partnerships. And I think we have seen even publicly the proliferation of whether it's coalescing around standards for the use of artificial intelligence or digital surveillance, that there are sort of common-minded communities of practice of, smaller communities of countries that are coming together to help define norms, absent, obviously an international legal architecture, which is a whole other bar that I don't think we're talking about at this point. But I think those smaller communities of countries that can build out and start capturing more and more countries who sort of want to sign up to this norm setting is really the direction we're going. Obviously there's always inherent tensions with how domestically our constitution and the constitutions and democratic norms and structures of other countries are set up. I mean, as we all know, even the simple freedom of expression in the United States as protected by our Constitution is quite different actually than a lot of our European allies, who often have more punitive and restrictive measures that they deploy against purveyors of disinformation. But the United States is obviously very grounded in our First Amendment and very grounded in what we think it is very clear that restricting information is not the solution. And so what we need to do is to empower people to identify misinformation through things like digital literacy and building communities that aren't necessarily government-led, but local communities that are able to come together around authority figures in their local community who can communicate where to find accurate information, how to assess accurate information. So that's one part that's highly cultural, but I think we need to really dig into how to support that. And then, the second piece, of course, is promoting the sharing of accurate, timely information in the face of disinformation and enabling those voices are out there. And then, of course, on the issue of technology, it's really complicated, but in everything from the development and deployment of artificial intelligence-enabled weapons systems to the use of the internet, there are all kinds of aspects on technology that will require the participation, not just of the democracy and human rights community that's participating on phone calls like this, but defense community, right? Intelligence communities, actors in countries, within ministries, and other private sector actors, corporations, and so on, that need to be involved to coalesce around certain norms and certain standards of behavior. And then, of course, finally, at the end of the day, we have to demonstrate how adherence to human rights respecting norms benefits people, right? How the use of digital technology in public administration or governance, how the the open and transparent use of it, a human rights respecting use of it benefits communities and governments, and how in comparison to more sort of restrictive, abusive measures, it works better for society. And so again, it comes back to that developing a narrative and evidence, quite frankly, to support the deployment of those sorts of technologies.
I think this is a really important point, just the idea that, partnership or collaboration across countries in terms of the sharing of the different technology and the management of that technology. And I think there is going to be a role for some kind of legal architecture, certainly around a more open internet at some point. But I think the other piece that you're pointing to, which is a really great one about the ways in which the democracy community needs to interface with other kinds of sectors and communities that are working in AI and other places, because of the ways in which that permeates our whole societies. And so anyway, I think that's a really great point. And so you're linking to sort of a next question I have, which is around what you mentioned, what the president has also mentioned quite frequently around making democracy deliver. This is certainly something he messages to audiences at home, and about it seems to permeate his approach to democracy globally. But what does this really look like, and how is it different from what we've kind of done in the past on this agenda about sort of cross-sectoral democracy work or otherwise? And what can we anticipate, I guess, from the administration in order to make the case for this?
That's a great question. And I like to joke that I'm going to start using the term DRG integration again to start scaring everybody, because we tried it. I don't know how effectively we tried it, but I think, we're trying a 2.0 now, which is that obviously preserving the institutions and norms of democracy and human rights are important. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to sort of achieve, I don't want to say win the battle, but win the battle of democracy versus autocracy, whatever we're calling it, if you can't demonstrate that democracies actually deliver on sort of human development indicators. And so for this administration, that's meant, for example, the G7, we launched the Build Back Better World initiative, which is supposed to be a values-driven, good governance, transparency-based approach to infrastructure development around the world, to demonstrate sort of that we don't need to go to the lowest common denominator to have development, that in fact, development based in the rule of law and with, creative development financing tools is the way to sort of achieve economic prosperity. So that's one thing in the economic development lane. And then, of course, for COVID and climate change, I think we have been recognizing that to promote resiliency to these shocks, to be able to in part prevent them and to be able to respond to them, doing that in a way that is respecting human rights and democratically governed is the way we should be going about this. And I think, climate change is a great example. A lot of different agencies, including USAID, are doing a climate, action plan or strategy that will include how democratic governance plays a part in this, how the most marginalized and disenfranchised people are the ones most affected by shocks like climate change and often by transmissible disease. And so being able to have their voices represented in decisions about them, both at the civil society level, but also being able to vote, run for office, and participate in governance is really critical. And so that does come down to the very thorny and often difficult prospect of having other development sectors, including the constant clash between development and humanitarian assistance, sort of look at how can we integrate these transparency, accountability, participation principles into all of our work. Because at the end of the day, most crises are man-made, human-driven, driven by crises manufactured by people. And so what we want to be able to do is to reduce that. And in the democracy and human rights sector, we make the argument that democracy and human rights will reduce those risks. And so I think it's a little bit of rehash of what we've been through over the last 4 years, but I think we want to do it in a more determined way, specifically through, climate response and COVID response and infrastructure, and find clear areas of development where we can integrate these principles. And then I would also say, because I love to give a shout out to political economy analysis, I think, having development writ large, and even a lot of our foreign policy undergoes some form of political economy analysis as it's deployed, is really helpful. It gets back to that question about national security interests of democracy versus other interests is often we don't do an analysis of the interests of certain actors in the short and long term and how that interacts with the interests of the population, different groups of the population, and these sorts of things we don't do, and then we're often caught unawares by adverse or unintended consequences. And so I think if we are able to better integrate DRG into other development sectors and foreign policy, it also helps us with the sort of interests trade-off as well.
Yeah, well, I think that hopefully what USAID started several years ago in terms of thinking about this, really through what you've just articulated, permeate through some of the other agencies and the way that other agencies deploy their tools and think about their various mechanisms of assistance in that way. Sounds like you guys are thinking about that. You also, just last point, the sort of governance roots of a lot of the sort of, I described it as exogenous challenges, but things obviously like climate, but also conflict, right? These are highly integrated sets of challenges in many places. And so also an area that was a real big focus under previous administration, especially through the development of the global fragility strategy. So I'm wondering how the Biden administration is thinking about the nexus of those two sets of issues, the fragility and conflict work, as well as the democracy work.
Yeah, I think, to be frank, it remains a challenge. It's always been a challenge, both policy-wise and bureaucratically, how we're set up to have the conflict and democracy and human rights communities talk to each other and be able to implement better work together. I think a mention of the Global Fragility Act, the GFA, is a great one. I think the GFA, that the strategy that was released in the last administration and sort of public follow-up to it, has made clear the governance and human rights, rule of law deficits that drive conflict, and that any response under the GFA, any sort of strategic reinvigorated response to reducing or addressing conflict, has to have a huge DRG lens. What that looks like in practice remains to be seen, but those of us, I know at the NSC and across departments and agencies, have been working to try to suss out what that actually means in practice. And I think the number one, hardest, but most straightforward thing to do is to ensure we're all speaking with the same voice, which is very hard. So Department of Defense, Justice, State, USAID, when they're engaging in a specific country, if one of our overarching objectives is to reduce conflict or address conflict, especially through resolving the root causes of that conflict, which are governance and human rights related, we all need to, in our different ways, be going towards that goal. And I think that's a perpetual struggle, but one we've identified. It's clear to us that we need to keep improving upon it. And so that challenge won't be resolved with this administration, I'm sure, but I highlight it as something that needs constant attention.
Well, you're certainly really well placed there to continue to elevate and put attention there. I think I will sort of end my pinging you with all of my thoughts and questions here and transition us over to Patrick for further kind of moderation of the conversation. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Ashlyn. Thanks so much, Tess, for your comments, and certainly to both of you for taking the time to be with us here today. We really appreciate it. So a few questions so far from audience members, but we'll encourage all of you on the screen in front of me here to enter your questions in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to all of them. So first, and this is both to Ashley and Tess, could you perhaps speak to the way in which the U.S. will or should further engage the global South in a more intentional way when it comes to democracy, rights, and governance?
Do you want to go first, Ashley? I feel like we both have many things to say.
You go first. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think, what's really important, the first thing is just to be very blunt. In planning for the Summit for Democracy, we have said numerous times, this cannot be a summit so white. I'm just going to put it out there. And that it's really, really important that when we talk about countries coming together to support democracy and human rights, that it applies to a wide variety of countries around the globe on many different paths of their sort of democratic transition and their democratic path. And so I think, one, it's first that engagement piece of engaging countries as partners, including from the global south, partners in their own democratic development. So that means using a diverse variety of tools. It can't just be finger wagging. It can't just be sanctions, right? It can't just be development and development aid in isolation. It needs to be sort of this holistic toolkit of supporting youth and civil society, and then also supporting governments, but then also holding governments accountable that are trampling on the rights of their citizens. And so I think, again, it demands more of that organized whole of government approach to use lots of different tools. I think we often default to very simple, diplomacy tool and some development aid, and we call it a day. So I think diversifying our approach would help. And then something that I'll, give a hat tip to my Carnegie colleagues on is the partnership approach, right? Of our actual development. Assistance or aid is trying to conceptualize some of it in a new way, that some of it's not just aid, some of it is learning partnerships, some of it is engaging on an equal basis in multilateral initiatives around best practices for democratic development or in tackling challenges around like election integrity. So I think I would say that, sort of the global south demands that the United States and countries that consider themselves donors in general sort of reevaluate what we think about when we think about democracy and human rights engagement and support.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there, first to piggyback, Tess, on your first point about kind of who's at the table kind of representing the US in certain contexts. I mean, I think there's a whole broader strategy that has to be brought to bear with regard to the kind of just recruitment of a diverse workforce in these sectors. I myself find myself often one of the only people that look like me in the kind of democracy promotion space often. And so I do think there are lots of different initiatives and efforts working on that. I think a second thing is just about, showing up really matters. And one thing that other countries are doing, such as China, Russia, they are, especially when it comes to, Africa, a region dear to my heart, and which I worked on for many years. There is FaceTime, both in going to engage with governments, but civil, in our cases, it would be great if we did that with civil society, but there's FaceTime in going from high level officials. And there's also efforts to bring people here to the US for these kinds of learning exchanges. And I think we sort of downplay these people to people kind of face-to-face exchanges, I think, in our approach, or we don't invest in them enough, or we don't elevate them enough, but they really are important, both, training and exchange, but also diplomatic tools for building relationships. And really it's a lot of this, or some of this at least, is about building those relationships. And sometimes I think we could do a much better job as the US in investing in that piece of it, as much as about giving the financial or technical assistance, is investing our time in that relationship piece. So that's all I'll add there.
Great points from both of you. Thank you so much. We have a question from Susan Abbott from Counterpart International, who asks, given the importance of a free and open internet to the DRG agenda, she's wondering if and how there is a more pronounced possibility or opportunity to interface with the quote unquote big tech community and a safe space conversation about the pros and cons, the ways in which they do and don't help underwrite democracy through technologies like WhatsApp and Facebook. So Ashley, Tess, any thoughts on that question?
Well, I won't claim to be an expert in this area, but I know that those sorts of conversations are already ongoing and encouraged. And I especially think these types of voluntary conversations that don't necessarily revolve around regulation are actually really important, again, for that norm setting and for getting buy-in with these technology companies and the private sector in general. I think sort of, again, getting into that political economy analysis and that sort of political science background and information that a lot of these companies don't have. I think simply sharing the information of the global landscape and often the differences between countries as well that are using technologies and sort of weaponizing them in different ways. They're uneven. And of course, every country also has different laws and regulations for operating for those, WhatsApp or Facebook to operate in those countries, which adds further complications. So I think from like a non-regulatory standpoint, what's really important is having discussions with these companies about, again, the short, medium, long-term impacts of complying, right, with a lot of the sort of takedown notices and other things that the United States would, normatively does not agree with, sort of the ramifications of them. So I just agree that those conversations are important.
Yeah, and I think that there's also a case to be made sort of for the market, a market-based argument to be made for bringing these companies in terms of the source of their client base and their customer base, their user base, and the sort of value proposition they could bring to that user base if they can, deliver this more open and free internet and maintain that without restricting rights. But I totally agree that I sort of feel like, this is a huge problem that isn't going to be solved without the social media companies in the room. And it's the idea that we could possibly address whether it's, misinformation, disinformation, or a new architecture for an open and free internet without engaging these partners in non-punitive, non-regulatory kinds of conversations. It just doesn't make sense. So they have to be in the room. The question is, what's the best forum for that, and how do we really engage in a productive sort of problem-solving dialogue? And part of that, requires them to come to the table and be willing to talk and share information as well. I think it's kind of a both sides thing. The maybe, we do have increasingly, I think, interestingly, people from our democracy community going into those companies, going into those sectors. So we should leverage those relationships, right, in ways that can facilitate those conversations. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there, since the people now speak each other's language. At least there's somebody inside there that will speak our language. So
thanks to both of you. Great responses. Question from Katie LaRoque from Interaction, who asks a bit of sectoral learning question, but when you look back at the last 15 years of democratic decline, do you think there are things the DRG sector could have done better? Was the sector funded sufficiently? Did it prioritize right interventions? And was it outsmarted by authoritarians? And along with all of that, did we innovate fast enough? Easy set of questions there for both you and Ashley.
That's a great question. And I'll also have you know that I've almost been doing this work exactly for 15 years. So it feels like oddly personal that the world has democratically backslid, exactly matched with when I joined USAID. Kind of amazing. So, I'm not sure. That's a great question. But something I've always pointed out is the policy community, every policy community, not just the United States, overinvestment in the personalization of democracy and power, of supporting individual leaders, which of course is important for diplomacy and negotiation. I'm not undervaluing it, but we don't really invest in institutions. And oftentimes when we do, right, that money or those programs might be pulled in another direction, even if it's within the same sector, like for election support, or outside the sector for, like we were discussing, other national security priorities that might be more important. And I think that is the perpetual challenge with DRG, is that the changes are over several years and they are generational. So it's hard to make a compelling case to stay the course over 15 years. And I think what we realize is that a lot of authoritarians were staying the course. And a lot of us who worked on the European region, right, are looking in the rearview mirror and saying, we started disengaging, right, around the early 2000s and saying, problem solved, there's democracy in Europe. And right, that wasn't the case. And per Ashley's point, just showing up, absent other sophisticated influence operations and everything else, simply showing up, engaging politically, engaging economically, including having hard conversations, right, with increasingly authoritarian governments. Those sorts of things, I think, maybe fell by the wayside. And so I think in moving forward, we all know and have said for years the many things we need to do: invest in institutions, invest in young people, like all of these sort of axioms that we could argue that they don't hold true because look what's happened over the past 15 years. But I would argue that we didn't actually invest in them properly for the past 15 years. And I would also say learning. We need to do a lot better, speaking of like a learning agenda, learning from our behavior and our mistakes. One could argue that in many conflict zones and transborder issues across the world, we repeat the same behavior and toolkit for the past 20 years, even today. That we don't have innovative and newer tools and approaches to these very thorny sort of conflicts and escalating human rights crises and coups, you name it. The same toolkit we used 20 years ago, we still use today. And I think we should be doing learning both internally and of course with partners outside, whether it's, a lot of NGOs on the line today or, USIP or academics, to demonstrate to us exactly what the impact has been of some of our decisions.
So I think that we have not done a good job of recognizing how intertwined, democracy and sort of democratic legitimacy is with economic performance and specifically with inequality. I think that many countries have, including this one, are facing dramatic levels of inequality and not governing inclusively, suffering from corruption, which Tess talked extensively about elsewhere. And there hasn't been, I think, enough attention to, that element of making democracy deliver for people. So I think we all certainly value the intrinsic role that democracy plays in creating free societies and facilitating participation. Well, I don't know that we've done a good job at the inclusion piece of that as a practice, making sure everybody had a piece of that. And I don't know that we've done a good job at making sure that that some didn't benefit at the expense of others, and particularly kind of the political elites. And the sort of kleptocrats that we're now trying to confront with new and different tools. So anyway, I think that I think we need to sort of think more about of course, the intrinsic, but the instrumental. And I do think this is why the president talks so much about making democracy deliver, because he knows that that is a key piece of the kind of legitimacy of the model. And that we can do good things and help people live good lives, but do it in a way that doesn't repress them and make them suffer and all of that. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Great, thanks to both of you. Great question, Katie. Thanks again. So seeing no other questions from the audience, I have a question for both of you. So Ashley has mentioned the role of China and Russia, and Tess has brought up innovation a few times. I'm curious to hear your thoughts looking ahead. What should the work on countering foreign authoritarian influence look like? So what have we learned in the past about what does and does not work vis-a-vis countering the likes of China and Russia? And what are some lessons should we be applying moving forward?
And so that's a really hard one. I mean, I will just briefly say that first, where it's possible, I think exposure is really important. Just exposing what's happening. There is a lot of misinformation because it's often not intentional of literally what's happening on the ground, whether it's in conflict zones or elsewhere. I think we all know Wagner, the Russian private military company, is in many countries, especially in Africa, and they literally distribute narratives that are untrue about sort of the value, the lack of value of sort of freedom and all of these other sort of democratic qualities, and the value of some of the behavior that they're helping to assist in these countries. And I think a lot of that, I mean, obviously the average American is not tracking that. And I think a lot of people in the countries affected by the behaviors of these influencers don't know either. And so I think just exposure in a very accessible way of what's happening and who's promoting this. The second thing is sometimes exposure happens and people don't care, right? Because they're getting their needs or something met by this malign influence. And so I think actually getting back to Ashley's point, having democracies deliver is actually a great way to counter this malign influence. And this isn't everything from like the very discreet, like, right, election security and being able to be competent in managing election administration, but also more widely distributing vaccines and responding to health crises and everything else, governments being able to engage with other democratic governance in good faith to donate or sell vaccines, to engage economically on a fair playing field, and to see the advantages in engaging on that stage as compared to perhaps engaging in more corrupt and less transparent sort of deals that are happening all the time. And I think, we don't like to use the term vaccine diplomacy because other countries do vaccine diplomacy, and the United States donates vaccines and also engages in good faith, economic exchanges and sales of those vaccines without a quid pro quo. And I think, again, being able to elevate those narratives around global health response or responding to climate change of we are engaging with you openly in good faith on these terms. So I think part of it is exposure and education. Part of it is doing better to have democracy deliver. And then part of it is, quite frankly, like a narrative and comms angle, right? A lot of us have talked about in democracy and human rights, the impact of perceptions. And to be able to like clearly demonstrate all of these things, I think is important.
I think that was pretty comprehensive. I don't know that I have much to add there, Patrick.
No, thanks, Tess. I certainly understood, Ashley. Let's see, question from Lisa McGregor. As you both point out, the DRG context seems to be getting even more complex. What concrete steps can we take as a community to update our toolbox and really work collaboratively? Great question. And she references corruption in particular.
That's a great question. I mean, and hi, Lisa. I see you're at the beach. That's excellent.
Yes, I'm at the beach every day to keep myself charged up. But, and by the way, Tess, you're not responsible for the backsliding. We all know that.
Okay,
you're responsible for keeping a tide on it, so to speak. But, just to elaborate on that, it's difficult to collaborate. It's really difficult to work for implementing partners. Now that I'm with an implementing partners, to really work together and then to work in partnership with USAID for all the reasons we know. So really, how can we do this? So we're not talking about these same terms and using those old tools, as you mentioned. They really need some updating, but how can we work together? Thank you.
I mean, this is a great question, and I'm not sure I have a silver bullet. And I think part of it gets to your question of like outdated terms is we all need shared terms we understand, right? And one example I'll give is I was talking to somebody about corruption, right? And corruption's linked to, which we haven't mentioned on this phone call because there's so many topics, but like corruption's linked to atrocities and fragility, like not just democratic governance, but a straight up state collapse and malign influence, as Patrick mentioned. And the person I was talking to was just not super familiar with like what does corruption mean, and so I boiled it down to like, do you know what government accountability and transparency, right? Like what the government's doing on a daily basis and how it's spending your money, and then you can hold them accountable for it, and you can attend budget meetings. You can like literally Google what they're doing, and it's not a secret, and they're not making secret deals, and sort of breaking it down to those terms like transparency and accountability. Like you want that in the health sector, right? Like you want that in the development of humanitarian aid. Like it's only bad if humanitarian aid is developed in a way or deployed in a way that's corrupt. And obviously corruption affects the delivery of humanitarian aid just like it does all forms of aid and development. And so I think being able to use terminology that is sort of less scary and more relatable. And also, I've just found oftentimes using the phrases like democracy and human rights as an umbrella makes people tune out. They're just sort of like values, like I mentioned before, but using concrete concepts or even like the rule of law. Like, you know that if a company is trying to come in here to do your development finance, whatever is happening on this program, like if the rule of law isn't great and they keep getting targeted by the government and they keep getting brought to like courts that are not legitimate, and then things percolate and nobody's clearing or approving their NGO registration because that's corrupt, like you see the impact of that. So that would be my pitch, is that first, get the messaging down to other sectors and other forms of development. And then second, also be able to offer concrete tools to people who are not in the DRG world, right? And that's why I've sort of mentioned political economy analysis, but even just more so be able to say like, hey, you're designing a program. Here are some language for your objectives that I would suggest for your health program, or I would suggest for the deployment of this humanitarian aid. Here's a financial transparency and accountability aspect that maybe you should build into the M&E so we can check more often to make sure resources aren't being siphoned. And that's a heavy lift, right? You need the time and resources to engage that way, but I think that might be the only way for it to systemically happen.
So Lisa, I mean, I feel like, hi Lisa, good to see you. I do feel like in your question is like, I hear, you know, that frustration with like just the the logistics of the collaboration, the coordination, the fact the incentives aren't there, the structural reasons why we can't, you know, work together. And I think that some of those questions are bigger than like, you know, the DRG space in particular. But I do think that you guys as partners have a huge intellectual kind of role to play in helping. You guys can be conveners in ways sometimes it's hard for government to be because they're busy. People are busy doing their procurements and they're all of the taskers. And I think, you know, I used to, when I was at state, I mean, I didn't have time to think. I would call up someone at Interaction and say, give me your 5 best ideas. And I need to go write a peacekeeping mandate. And like, you know, people are busy. We rely on the smart people outside, not that we don't care and aren't smart ourselves, but I think that partners can and should play in part, you know, partnership with USAID and others, but rely on that. The other thing I think is important, and I'll point to you, Tess, which is that especially when it comes to the interagency part of this, it really does, leadership really matters on that, right? Like if we want to foster kind of collaboration around a set of new ideas around a particular area, just like, you know, they did with atrocity prevention, right? They said, this is a problem set. We have a multitude of tools, or trafficking, right? That we, from a multitude of agencies that we can bring to bear against on this problem. And then these people don't normally talk to each other. And so we're going to make you, and we're going to make you develop a plan. And, you know, we're going to write, you know, you guys are going to, you know, figure out how you implement that plan. But I do think that leadership matters. So for what it's worth, Lisa, you guys, I think, have a lot of role to play as partners in helping, you know, to create the space for you know, new ideas in this area.
Thanks, Lisa. Great question. Thanks also to Ashley and Tess. Great responses as always. A question from Alonso Sardon from the Open Government Partnership. The second part of his question in particular is talking so much about partnerships across the board is resonating quite a bit with him. OGP will celebrate its 10th anniversary next Monday. Any updates on USG plans around the OGP domestic processes?
Okay, that's a lot. That's, yeah. I have to think about how to respond. I mean, I think that, you know, what you're talking about, again, is ultimately sort of this interdependence between domestic and international, I don't want to call it democracy, support and promotion. And that might actually, aside from Lisa's question, might be one of the hardest things we're trying to do here, especially in establishing partnerships that aren't just the traditional like international to international facing partnerships on this issue. I actually think in the anti-corruption space, we're a lot farther along than in other sectors, simply because of the almost impossibly domestic, like it's the non-domestic nature of corruption. It's necessarily across borders when we're talking about financial systems and illicit actors and everything else. And so I think we've been able to make a little bit more progress in the anti-corruption space on sort of linking domestic international partnerships. I mean, OGP is a great example, right, of like national action plans around the world in individual countries, as well as the one in the United States. And ultimately, at the end of the day, as like the founder of the OGP, a domestic action plan in the United States motivates and sets a model for people abroad. But the issue always is, especially in the United States, that domestic facing agencies and policy and international facing agencies and policy are not the same people and are often not even in the same mechanisms. And I always use this example of some of our favorite small Northern European countries that seem to have their act together. Is I had a colleague joke to me once, like, well, when you're the size of Rhode Island, it's a lot easier to have your Ministry of Interior, Foreign Affairs, and like, public administrative internal functions to all talk to each other in a way that's really challenging for the United States and for a lot of other larger and more federalized countries. So I don't think I have an answer or solution, but I think this attention to sort of international and domestic partnerships and trying to find and push more and more on how to make those linkages is something that we should sort of also turn to, and might also be one of the answers to the previous question of why our work in the last 15 years maybe wasn't as successful as it could have been.
Can I just make a plug here, though, for, the OGP model really is this idea of like peer-to-peer learning, right? Mutual learning. And I think, my colleagues at Carnegie have written about this and this sort of the ways in which, even from a domestic to foreign policy or foreign international development perspective, we need to engage much more in a process of mutual learning across domestic and foreign policy vis-a-vis democracy. And I think there's a lot to be learned from how OGP has managed to do that on a global scale within that open government space about how we can do more of that mutual learning. And I certainly, in my new role with the Partnership for American Democracy, am interested in that and how we can cross-pollinate on the domestic and foreign policy side. But also, I think U.S. democracy has, can learn from some of the innovations, right, that are being, piloted or used successfly in other democratic countries. So I think there's a lot to be learned from this kind of partnership, and I know that the administration is thinking about how to do it more authentically vis-a-vis its domestic process as well.
Our next question is from Anthony Orlando, USAID OTI. The panelists have touched on this in their discussions about implementer support, but what is the role of aid in conjunction with diplomacy to promote and build democracy overseas? That is, what are the limits of international assistance, and where do you see assistance as most effective in achieving these goals? Best practices or lessons that can be applied, so on and so forth, and the link between and complementarity between diplomacy and foreign assistance in achieving democratic progress overseas.
Well, first I want to thank Anthony from OTI for sort of countering my democracy and conflict people don't talk to each other comment. So I'm very thrilled you're here. And then second, so this is really one of the biggest challenges in foreign policy making, is the interplay between diplomacy and development, especially when it comes to democracy policy. And I think it gets back to the question before of what tools we have at our disposal. I will actually say there are a lot of challenges, oftentimes like these emerging crises, sort of conflicts that happen where, obviously to respond in the moment, the development assistance that's been happening for years or decades is, to be frank, can't be the answer to immediate conflict resolution or immediately responding to sort of a malign actor or an authoritarian. And oftentimes we are sort of not aware of what else is out there. And what else is out there is often our typical diplomacy toolkit of let's issue a strong statement, or let's try to engage other diplomats to say strong things. And I admit, I actually don't know what all tools are there. And so I would welcome people on this call, as well as others, to think of and submit ideas in general when you're writing papers and things like that, of how can development and diplomacy complement one another, and what tools work where and why. And one of my favorite examples is sanctions. Sanctions are often deployed without a connection to sort of the impact and effectiveness, right? They are often a messaging tool. And so we have these conversations about sanctions. We have these conversations about multilateral action at the UN. We have these conversations about development sort of in isolation from one another, which is another sort of confounding issue, which is even when we try to see, do these tools work, we ask if they work in isolation. And so I think the big question per your question is, what variety of tools could be paired together to affect change? And I think that's an open question that I don't have a good answer to, but I would encourage the broader community to provide suggestions.
Yeah, I agree. There are lots of diplomatic tools that exist in that big building over there on in Foggy Bottom that don't get trotted out. I mean, there's even just the economic bureau, like that. Who knows what they do there? I never, I don't know, but I imagine the potential of a whole line of effort around economic diplomacy teed up with other kinds of the work of other domestic agencies on that kind of policy. So I do think that there's other tools that we don't necessarily leverage across our diplomatic toolkit. I do think, though, that I have seen development in diplomacy work very effectively in certain kinds of situations, in particular when they were working towards a common goal and working in partnership with others. So I'm thinking about, for example, like a Kenya election, where you have the diplomatic community lined up together in terms of the messaging that the international community is giving to the government. Yeah, we expect this to be peaceful. We're going to accept the results. But also, then you have a sort of very coordinated set of interventions from a programmatic side that's helping to support, again, this common goal of a peaceful and credible election. So I do think they can work together in those cases really well, coordinated, and again in conjunction with other partners, development and diplomatic partners. It would be actually a really good kind of somebody should do a study on this, actually. Like somebody should look at some cases, and maybe they have, but anyway, it would be interesting to examine that. It's a good question.
A great point, Ashley. It speaks to the need for the importance of country-specific strategies, true strategies with a goal, theory of success, with lanes for aid and state and true collaboration. Next question comes from Derek Brinkerhoff, RTI International, who asks, given recent events in Afghanistan, do you have any thoughts on how to combat the narrative that democracy promotion is a fool's errand? The making democracy deliver argument has in the past created unrealistic expectations. In the case of Afghanistan, has demonstrated how fragile changes are and how rapidly that can be undone. So Ashley, Tess, any thoughts on this?
And I think the president has said publicly before on Afghanistan that it was not meant to be state building. And what that means is it's not state building at the barrel of a gun. And I think that's the lesson that we need to take from this. That is, when you're supporting democracy and democratic development, has to be locally driven. It cannot be imposed from the outside, and it can be supported from the outside. But I think the takeaway is that not primarily through military means. And I'm actually going to reference the Stabilization Assistance Review. I'm just bringing in all kinds of references to this conversation, which talks about stabilization, which arguably is one of many things that was tried in Afghanistan. And at the end of the day, it's fundamentally a political endeavor, strongly supported by sort of development assistance and development in general, with a supporting role as necessary by military and defense forces. And I think that framing is actually really helpful because in the case of Afghanistan, and I think a lot of other sort of war and crisis contexts, it's the reverse. And the military planning and the military end states lead first, and then you sort of reverse engineer to, oh, what we meant was democracy. And I think when you do that and you don't start with what Patrick mentioned as a theory of change that is tested constantly and that isn't static, is that you face these challenges. And so I think moving forward, I would take heart and motivation from the difficulties and challenges and failures we've seen across the globe to do better and to sort of reinforce the need to have locally driven and sort of politically inclusive processes from the start.
The only comment I would make is I think that the questioning about whether, the effectiveness of democracy assistance and whether our strategies have worked is a good one. We should be asking that because it permeates a lot of what has happened in a lot of countries. Afghanistan to me is an exception because of the uniqueness of the case, the fact that it was tied to the military intervention, and it was also such an extraordinary amount of money that no other place is possibly comparable to it. So to me, it's really hard to look at that and say we should draw deep lessons for our assistance because no other place have we done what we did there, and we're unlikely to do it anywhere else again like that. So I think it's much more useful to look at everywhere else and try to understand what's been successful and not successful in those cases.
Let me just add, that's a great point that Ashley makes. And I think this is sort of comparative lessons learned to get to country-specific strategies is also really helpful. Something that I've done before, whether it resulted in success or not, was, engaging external partners, semi-external partners like USIP, and saying, hey, we're engaging in country X. They're going through a political transition towards a peace process. What are other countries that have had similar transition conditions, similar peace processes, similar national dialogues, right? Really drill down in sort of a research way of where have the conditions been similar, what has led to success, what has led to failure, and not obviously copying those plans, but being able to come from a place of more knowledge so that, again, you're not applying global universal sort of approaches to very particular contexts, but being able to draw on similar contexts and then tailoring them, I think, again, gets down to that planning and strategy and figuring out what works.
Thanks, Tess. Excellent point on the importance of focusing on comparable contexts and perhaps Afghanistan being the outlier. So Richard Nash is asking, noting the recent NSC memorandum to develop a new anti-corruption strategy, what new things or approaches do you anticipate might be included in that strategy? And will there be an opportunity for input by implementing partners, think tanks, researchers, and so forth?
So that's a great question. And I know that my colleague, Chandana, who is here at the NSC, some of you may know her, who's our anti-corruption director, has been engaged with a lot of sort of external and civil society consultations as we draft this NSSM. So I can't speak to specific consultations, but I am sure that there is openness to continued consultations. And I would say that there's a wide range. And as you saw from the NSSM, I'm forgetting how many, there might've been 10 areas more, everything ranging from real estate to beneficial ownership to reforming foreign assistance and putting in anti-corruption guardrails into foreign assistance. So it ranges from sort of the more foreign assistance development aspects to actual suggestions for changes to laws, both domestically and internationally. And as well as, let's not forget the involvement involvement of civil society and media in holding governments accountable for their commitments to anti-corruption, which I think is also important. Oftentimes we're focused on sort of enforcement actions and punitive actions, but we also want to be able to focus on prevention as well, and exposure. And so having the involvement of people in these governance systems from the start to sort of expose as well as prevent corruption. So that's a very general answer, but always happy to connect with you offline and connect you with Chandana. I'm just passing on work. That's what I'm doing here.
Thanks, Tess. Thank you, Richard, for the question. Certainly agree with you, Tess. Prevention, absolutely critical in the fight against corruption. I don't see any further questions in the chat, but do want to take the opportunity to ask anyone who has yet to put something in the chat. If you want to chime in, turn your video on and ask it directly to Ashley or Tess, or put it in the chat before we wrap up. Seeing none, thank you both, Ashley and Tess. Truly appreciate you taking the time. Great questions from the audience. I know we at SID deeply appreciate it. I will now hand it over to Malvika to